The woman I was supposed to marry vanished the morning of our wedding, and 38 years later, a stranger with her eyes brought me back from the edge and asked if I still meant the promise I made at 21. Hey folks, it's your old pal Hank from Mind-Blowing Stories. Before I get rolling, I have to say this, even though it makes me feel like a nagging granddad. 96% of you who watch aren't subscribed. That number stings a little. If you enjoy these stories, hit subscribe, throw a like on this one, and tell me what you felt down in the comments. It keeps the lights on, and it keeps me honest. All right, deep breath. Here we go. My name is Henry Dalton, but everyone calls me Hank. I'm 68, retired from the machine shop and living quieter than I ever thought I would, out where the sky looks like a wide blue lid someone set over the town. I keep a tomato garden that refuses to obey me, and a little dog named Cookie who refuses even more. And I run this channel to tell you the stories that still rumble around in my chest like thunder. Today is about Laura. It's about the first time I learned what forever means, and the last time I believed in it like a kid. We met in Wichita in the spring of '79. I was 22, a wrench in my pocket and grease under my nails, working at Murdoch Street Motors and taking night classes at the community college, because my old man said a man should always have two ways to make a living. Laura Beth Carter walked into the parts counter with a sun-bleached apron on and a list from her mother's station wagon. She had a little smear of flour on her cheek from the bakery down the road, where she'd been helping before her shift at the bank. She was all motion, like a song with feet. I remember the way she squinted at the shelves and bit her lower lip when she couldn't find what she needed. I asked if I could help. She looked up and said, "I hope so, mister, because I am out of polite words for this day." I gave her the filter and the washer fluid and threw in a pack of peppermint gum from the counter. She laughed at that, told me her mother said gum made a girl look cheap. I asked if she believed that. She said she didn't believe anything unless it proved itself twice. That sounded like both a dare and a door closing, and somehow that made me braver than anything. I asked if she wanted coffee after her shift. She told me she didn't drink coffee at night because it made her heart kick. I said milkshakes. She said chocolate. 2 hours later, we were at the chrome counter in Dottie's diner, sharing a plate of fries while she told me everything and nothing about her life. Her father had died when she was 16. She lived with her mother in a little orange house with fake shutters that were just boards nailed as decoration. She worked as a teller at First Sunflower Bank and took community college classes that didn't match any one plan. She liked music and literature and kept changing her mind about what to be. She had a bad habit of saying yes before she thought it through. She said that last part without looking at me, then winked. I told her I didn't have much to brag about. I could rebuild a carburetor with my eyes closed, and I was good at guessing how long a thunderstorm would last by the smell of hot asphalt. She said the second thing sounded made up, then opened her eyes a little when I got the next one right. It wasn't love at first sight, because to be honest, love at first sight is just your eyes playing tricks. It was love the second night, when she forgot her wallet, and I said I had her covered, and she seemed both grateful and mad about it, as if she didn't want to owe anybody anything. We did the small-town courtship thing without calling it that. Homemade sandwiches on the tailgate at the drive-in. Sunday afternoons at the park where old men played horseshoes and shouted like baseball coaches. We fed ducks in a pond with a green scum halo and pretended it was pretty. I took her to meet my mother, who made a meatloaf and then gave me a warning look in the kitchen. "She can break your heart if she wants to," my mother said. I didn't ask how she knew. Mothers always know the shape of the knife. There was always a little shadow around Laura I couldn't name. She had this habit of checking reflections in windows as we walked, not to admire herself, but to see what was behind us. She didn't like when anyone stood behind her at the bank counter. She carried a cheap little locket on a chain and never took it off. When I asked what was inside, she said it was empty. When I asked why wear an empty locket, she said it was a reminder there was always space for something. She joked, then she didn't. We had a little trouble too. That spring, a man named Randy started showing up where we were. He had the kind of haircut you only get if you think a haircut will change your luck. He'd gone to high school with Laura, dated her for a minute, and handled rejection by acting like the decision wasn't final yet. He'd sidle up at the bar, all elbows and cheap cologne, and say things like, "New guy, huh?" And I'd say something I thought was brave, but probably just sounded young. She always told me to stand down. She said Randy was more bark than bite, and that he was good at finding trouble and bad at knowing when to stop. I thought I knew how to measure that kind of man. I didn't. We decided to get married in July of '81. It wasn't some grand proposal. I bought a modest ring from Mr. Tran's pawn shop, and we ate chili dogs in the park, and I asked, and she cried in a way that suggested she'd been holding her breath for months. We were both broke, so we planned a backyard wedding at her mother's house. Strands of borrowed lights, a rented sound system that hissed like a cat. My cousin Dave agreed to grill chicken if he could control the playlist and make us dance to some nonsense. We argued about whether to write our own vows. She said her voice did funny things when she was nervous. I said that was only more reason to do it. We put the invitations together at my kitchen table, envelopes that didn't seal right unless you licked them twice. I remember thinking that was a good omen for a kissable marriage. Funny, the things you think. The week before the wedding, something shifted. Laura started sleeping with the radio on, low, tuned to the all-night talk station that played soft distractions between callers. She would sit on her porch steps after midnight and watch the empty street like it was a movie. She told me nothing was wrong, that she just had a lot on her mind. She said her manager at the bank had gotten in trouble for losing track of cash transfers, and the office was tense. She said Randy had come in through her line and whispered something that sounded like a joke until it didn't. When I asked what, she shook her head and said he wanted me to think he was scary, which meant he was scared of something bigger. She said life doesn't like clean lines, Hank. Life is a kid with a crayon. Then she kissed me and told me not to worry. I worried anyway. I woke up on my wedding day to a bird tapping at my kitchen window as if it had the right to knock. Sunlight flooded everything. I shaved twice and hated my tie, and ironed it and still hated it. I drove to her mother's house to help set up chairs and found the gate open, the yard crowded with folding tables, and her Aunt Deb crying into a dish towel. Deb and I had never been close, but I took the towel and said her name, and she shook her head and said, "Laura's not here." I stood there with the towel for a long moment while my brain searched for something reasonable to do with my hands. Her mother walked out with a face made of stone and said there had been an emergency at work and that Laura had gone in early. That made no sense. She said it again as if repetition would make it true. I went to the bank. It wasn't open yet. I circled the block like a dog who forgot where home was. At 9, I pushed through the door and asked for her. The assistant manager, a woman with hair sprayed into a helmet, said Laura had called in sick. I stood there and watched my own breath fog the glass partition because the air conditioning was too high. I went to Dottie's and sat in our booth. and the waitress asked if I wanted chocolate milkshake or coffee, because those were the two things I ordered when the world felt wobbly. The ring in my pocket felt like a coin I wasn't allowed to spend. Noon became 3. 3 became 5. Folks started to call my mother. My mother tried to call Laura's mother and got a disconnected tone that seemed like a cruel joke of timing. At 6, a car I didn't know stopped outside my apartment. 2 men in suits got out. They looked like the kind of men who didn't knock twice if you didn't answer fast, so I did. They showed me badges I didn't have time to focus on. They asked if I was Henry Dalton. They stepped inside and didn't wait for me to say yes. They spoke low and too smooth. The words felt like a stone skipping across my skull. Law enforcement, witness safety, immediate danger, necessary precautions. We're not at liberty, cooperative witnesses, protective relocation. They didn't say the word forever, but I heard it echo in the space where my life had been 5 minutes before. They told me 2 things I understood. 1, there had been an incident at the bank where Laura worked. 2, for her safety and for mine, they had to separate us. They said it was temporary. They said when the situation was resolved, there would be a process. They did not define process. They asked me not to go to the wedding, to avoid the church, to lay low for a bit. I asked if she was okay. They said yes. Then they said, as far as we know, and I realized how thin that yes had been. I asked where she was. They said they could not disclose that. I asked if she knew they were telling me this. They didn't answer that one. I did not go to the wedding I had planned for months. I did not know what else to do with the day I had built into a kind of altar. So I drove to the river. There's a spot near the keeper of the plains where the water moves fast enough to look like it's thinking. I took the little ring out of my pocket, and I did something I am not proud of. I threw it. It flashed once in the sunlight and disappeared. A man on a bench, a stranger with a red ball cap, said, "You'll regret that." I told him I already did. That summer went long and mean. People said everything and nothing. Some folks thought I'd been left at the altar. A few thought I'd gotten cold feet and made up a story to cover it. I went back to work because if I didn't hold a wrench, I was going to hold a bottle. My boss looked at me like a good dog that had been kicked by somebody else. My mother made casseroles and then grew quiet, as if she'd run out of language. I started sleeping on the couch because my bed felt like a courtroom. I kept expecting a call. The call didn't come. In September, I received a letter. It came in one of those thin federal envelopes that look like a warning, and I set it on the table and stared at it for an hour before I opened it. It was written in the kind of careful penmanship you use when you don't want to be misunderstood. It was not from Laura. It was from a man whose name I've never been fully sure was real. The letter said, in 100 careful ways, that she was safe, and that the decision to remove her, the morning of the wedding, was made because of a threat. It said impulses of contact were dangerous. It said there would be a time for explanations. It said if I cared for her, I would be patient and quiet. It said these words, like they were instructions for assembling furniture. I put the letter in the drawer and closed it lightly, as if the noise could break the words. I did not hear from Laura. Months turned into a year. The machine shop moved locations and brought me with it. Wichita felt like someone had shifted all the furniture 2 inches to the left. I pulled a coffee cup from the cabinet each morning and saw a ghost stacked behind it, then closed the door and tried to live without ghosts. There's no glory in telling you I dated someone else, but I did. Her name was June. We got married on a Saturday that passed without weather or trouble. June deserved a lot more than me all dimmed down. After 7 years, she said she was tired of being the backdrop to a story I wouldn't tell. We split clean. Nobody broke dishes or blamed the other. A grown-up ending, which felt worse somehow. Time, that stubborn mule, kept walking. My mother got sick, and then got sicker. In 2002, I sat in a chair in her room at St. Francis and held her hand while the machines did the steady work. She looked at me with that look that knows the shape of the knife, and she said she had something to confess before she went. I said she didn't owe me anything. She said she did. In a box in the back of her closet, underneath a blanket I had made in shop class and forgotten, I found 3 letters addressed to me. The handwriting was Laura's. I knew it the way you know the shape of your own name in a crowd. The postmarks were from the fall of '81. They were unopened. My mother had kept them. My mother, who had lost a husband young and did not trust anything that looked like a fairy tale, had decided that protecting me meant choosing for me. If you loved her, I loved her too, she said, and I believed her, even as anger hit me so hard I needed to sit on the floor. I opened the letters with hands that wouldn't listen to me. The first was short. She said she had been moved to a place she wasn't allowed to describe. She said it was safe but didn't feel like life. She said she had not chosen this and that she hoped I knew that. She said a man I didn't know had been skimming funds through the bank, using fake accounts tied to people's social security numbers, and when she found it and didn't look away, she opened a door that didn't close. The second letter was longer. She said they had given her a new last name and told her to practice signing it until it felt like it belonged to her hand. She said we were not done, but that done and not done were not words she got to hold anymore. The third letter was the one that has lived in my chest ever since. She said she was pregnant. She was pregnant, and she had written to tell me in the only way she could, and the letters never reached me. She said she had wanted to wait until she could say it to my face, but her handlers had used phrases like unnecessary strain and conditions for contact, so she wrote instead. She said she had told the truth about the numbers and stayed alive, and now there was a new life that meant the truth would keep echoing. She said she didn't know how anything was going to work. She said she was sorry for more things than she could count. She said she named the baby Grace, in her head because she needed the reminder. I sat on my mother's carpet and felt my heart split in 3. One piece broke for me, one for Laura, one for the child who had arrived in a world that had hidden her from me. My mother tried to touch my shoulder. I flinched, which is not how you want your last months with your mother to go. We had time to talk it through. She said she had been scared I would run into danger. She said she had lost one man to a bad road and wasn't losing me to a bad decision. She cried like I'd never seen. We made peace in a way that included the cracks. When she died that November, I put the letters in my jacket pocket and didn't sleep for 2 days. I tried to find them. I called numbers that didn't pick up. I went to the bank and talked to an assistant manager who had been a teller back then and told me, with the hush of a gossip and the fear of a teller who knows the vault code, that the story had gotten ugly quickly. The man at the center of it all had friends. Those friends had guns. There had been a threat made that morning at the wedding that mentioned my name, and the marshals had decided to choose speed over kindness. She told me this like she was still holding her breath. I left shaking. I had one friendly acquaintance on the city police force who owed me a favor because I'd rebuilt his Camaro carburetor for nothing once. He told me witness protection is like a sealed jar placed on a high shelf. He said sometimes the jar comes down, and sometimes it stays there, with all its labels peeled off. The years folded over themselves. I worked, I cooked, I took up night, walking around my block, because sleep and I were no longer on good terms. I dated a little, and then not at all. I learned how to be Uncle Hank, and then Great Uncle Hank. I learned how to keep going when going didn't offer me any prizes. And then, one hot August afternoon, I learned that life is not a straight line. It is a circle that keeps pretending to be a line. I was flying through Denver to visit my cousin Dave in Boise. Airports are airports. You watch people run to gates and wonder what they're late for. You watch kids who should not be drinking that much orange soda. I was standing at a coffee stand, feeling too old to stand that long, when the world went bright and then sideways. Pain folded my chest like a wallet. I remember the taste of pennies. The floor introduced itself to the side of my face. There were voices, and then there was one voice. "Stay with me, sir. Can you hear me? Sir, look at me. I need you here." It was a woman's voice, strong and steady, doing its best to be a bridge between two cliffs. Hands were on my chest. Someone counted, not in panic but in a practiced rhythm. I tried to follow the numbers and missed them. The voice kept calling me back. I felt my ribs complain. Then I felt something else. Air, like a gift. I coughed and found the ceiling again. A face leaned over mine, brown hair pulled back, eyes the color of iced tea that had sat in the sun too long. She smiled the way a person smiles when a thing they've worked for finally happens. Later, I would think that the smile was a long echo from a life I had once let go of. "My name is Grace," the woman said. "Off duty, but an ER nurse is never really off." "You scared us. Can you say your name?" I said Hank. She said, "Good." I asked how many fingers, how much pain, those mean little tests that make you want to push the hands away. She told me shoving wasn't allowed for people who just got brought back. She went with me in the ambulance until the real team took over. Before they wheeled me down a hall, she squeezed my hand, and I noticed her necklace. It was a cheap little locket. I could tell by the way the light didn't take to it. She saw me looking. "Gift from my mum," she said. What she didn't say sat in the air between us like a note that hadn't landed yet. I spent 2 days at the hospital. They said it had been a small heart attack, and they had gotten to me in time. And it was good I had started walking in the mornings because that had helped, and wasn't that something? A young resident with a serious face told me to eat less salt. I told him I was from Kansas, and he grimaced like a man who had just told a rancher to stop liking steak. When they sent me home, I had more pills than groceries, a fear I couldn't summarize, and a memory of the nurse who had walked me back from somewhere I didn't want to name. I couldn't stop thinking about her voice. I couldn't stop thinking about her locket. A week later, my phone rang with a number I didn't know. I let it go to voicemail because I have a rule about unknown numbers. The caller hung up without leaving a message. The number called again. I answered. "Hank," the voice said. I knew the voice before I knew why I knew it. A human heart is not as slow a learner as we claim. What do you say when you hear a voice you have spoken to for years in your head, but not with your mouth? I sat down without meaning to. I said her name. "Yes," she said, "it's me." I had to wait a long time to say that. I asked if she was safe. Old habits we do not know we have. She laughed in a way that made my hands shake. She said she wanted to see me. She said we had a lot to cover. She said one more thing. "Grace is our daughter. If my heart had not been recently repaired, it might have given up then, just out of a sense of drama." She told me the nurse who had saved me, had a name she had whispered before anyone else did. She told me Grace had found my name on the hospital paperwork and recognized it because Laura had told her my name when she was old enough to carry a secret without setting it down somewhere careless. I closed my eyes and saw the locket. I asked where. She said Kansas City. I got in my truck and started driving a little too fast for a man with fresh stitches. We met at a small coffee shop near Union Station, the kind with oversized mugs and mismatched furniture that makes you feel like you fell into your aunt's living room. She stood up when I walked in. It was not one of those movie reunions where the music changes and everything softens. It was stranger and better. Two grown people who had lived a lot more life than they planned stood and looked at the pieces that had come from an old story. Her hair had threads of silver now. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that were a map of laughter and waiting. We did not hug like teenagers. We stood and held each other like people who know the cost of touch. You should have seen me then, folks. I'm not ashamed to tell you I cried. She cried too. We sat and let the coffee go cold. We told the outline first and then filled it in. She told me the details, the parts I had guessed and the parts I could not have. The bank manager who had thought he was smarter than the system. The men behind him, who were smarter still. The discovery she had made by accident because she was the kind of person who checked her work twice. The threats that followed. The federal men who had told her that leaving was saving. The morning of our wedding, there had been a message sent to her mother that included my name. She had made the agents promise to tell me they had taken her. They had promised something like that, and then failed to deliver anything like kindness. Witness safety saves lives, she said, but it doesn't rescue feelings. She had been moved to Oregon under a last name that still felt like it belonged to someone else. She lived in a town where nobody asked questions they didn't want the answers to. She worked at a thrift store. She gave birth at a hospital where the nurses wore pastel uniforms and hummed. She held Grace and wanted to bolt back across the country and put her on my chest. But the marshals told her that her old life had been set on fire. She was 23 with a new name and a baby and a story that couldn't be told. She made a decision that some people will never forgive her for, and that I will never judge. She gave the baby to a family she had chosen with care, a mother who could not carry one of her own, and a father who looked like the man I might have become if I had grown up with gentle weather instead of tornado warnings. She stayed in touch only as much as the system allowed. A letter a year, a photograph sometimes. She called the little girl Grace in her head, and then in her letters until it stuck. She told me she had met a good man in Oregon, whose life had been simpler than ours. They got married when Grace was 5. He was kind, but he died of a heart murmur nobody knew was there. She worked and waited, and tried to make a life on the edges of her own. Years turned her into the sort of woman who can make any room a little safer just by being in it. She never stopped hoping the door would open. She never stopped thinking about the day it had closed. I told her about the letters my mother had hidden. We sat with that for a minute, because there are pains you don't rush. Laura said she believed my mother had loved me the best way she could, even if it meant she got to keep being angry at her in the small private way that anger can be a souvenir. I told her about June, about the years that climbed on my shoulders. She told me about the families that had come into the thrift store looking for winter coats and left with warm stories because she knew how to make a person feel seen. We talked until the coffee shop closed. The young barista flipped chairs onto tables and glanced at us like he knew an important chapter was being written and didn't want to be the villain who ended it early. We walked outside, halfway to a hug, and then just standing there in the Midwest night. I can't promise you anything simple, Laura said. Simplicity isn't one of the things I can give. I told her I had made peace with complicated. She smiled and slipped her hand into mine, like it had always lived there. Grace met me a week later. There's no way to explain that moment to someone who hasn't tasted it. She had my father's eyes and Laura's mouth. She stood with a nurse's posture, ready to jump in if a person went down. She called me Hank and then stopped and looked at my face, and I think we both knew the word that would break something open. "Dad," she said, so quietly that the sound felt like a small bird landing on a windowsill. I had practiced not collapsing. I failed. I rested my forehead against hers, like we were two kids in a sandbox planning our complicated future. I told her what I knew. She filled in the blanks. She had grown up loved. Her adoptive parents had told her as much of her origin story as the papers allowed. She had searched a little when she was old enough to choose what to do with her curiosity. In her 20s, she had crossed paths with Laura in a thrift store parking lot on a bright day that made everyone squint. Laura had introduced herself as the woman who had carried her. Grace had said thank you 100 ways. They had chosen careful closeness, 1,000 small steps. Grace told me she had read my name on a chart in the emergency bay and stared at it until the letters were no longer just letters. She told me the world had gone quiet like it does right before a firework explodes. She told me she fought with herself for an entire night about whether she should reach out. She told me she finally called Laura first and said the name out loud. Laura had not slept until she called me. We were 3 people standing in a parking lot with more history than conversation. And somehow, we made a conversation big enough for all that history anyway. I brought them both back to Wichita that fall. It was a weird pilgrimage. The town had changed just enough to shove at my memory. The car lot where I had worked was now a weirdly lit yoga studio. Dottie's Diner had moved 3 storefronts down and lost its chrome counter, and the shakes were too sweet because everything is too sweet now. The keeper of the planes was still where I had thrown the ring. I stood there with Laura and Grace and told them what regret looks like when it reflects sunlight. Grace squeezed my hand. Laura passed me something small and cool. It was a ring, not the same one. You can't unthrow what you've thrown, but it was the same design, a modest little band with a tiny stone, the kind you buy with stubborn hope more than money. I asked where she'd found it. She said a thrift store in Oregon. We laughed until people stared. Here is a thing I need to say because I promised you unexpected turns, and not all of them are kind. Life gave us 2 years that felt like stolen time, and then it cashed in its chips. Laura got sick, breast cancer that had behaved itself, and then decided it was done behaving. She didn't want pity. She wanted clear water and clear words. We sat in waiting rooms that all smell the same, and held hands in the sort of silence that married people discover somewhere between year 5 and year 10. We were not married, but we had earned that silence. I learned how to cook all the food a sick person can stand to smell. I learned how to do the paperwork that tries to turn a person into a file. Grace learned how to be both a daughter and a nurse without letting either job consume the other. Laura learned to accept help and still boss us around. She was good at both. One day near the end, Laura asked me to drive to a lake we used to go to when we were 20 and had both knees. We sat in folding chairs like retirees and watched a couple of kids fish with a patience that made me proud of their parents. She told me she had one request. I said yes before she named it. She said she was tired of secrets and wanted me to tell this whole story one day, the way I was good at telling things, out loud, with the parts that make people wince left in. She said our story had been stolen and then hidden and then found, and she wanted it to be useful to somebody who thought they were the only one living in a strange hallway between then and now. She said if I told it, maybe someone would put down a bottle, or pick up a phone, or forgive their mother, or forgive themselves. She died in early spring, a day that tried to be cheerful and didn't quite get there. We were with her. Her last sound was a soft sigh, like someone who finally found their favorite chair after a long day. The funeral was small and honest. Grace gave a eulogy that made every throat in the place hurt. I stood at the back and felt a kind of peace I had read about but not believed in. Her headstone says her Oregon name, but inside my chest there is another marker that says the name I met at a parts counter. That's how it works. We carry two truths at once. We learn to let them live side by side, like neighbors who share a fence and borrow sugar. I'm telling you this now in my 60s because Laura asked me to and because I want to, and because a man gets to a point where he understands the difference between what he lost and what he never had, and he stops running from one by pretending it's the other. I lost a lot when they took her. I did not lose the part that stood in the dark and waited for my name. That part sat with me in hospital rooms and airports and little Midwestern diners, and finally got to sit at a kitchen table with the two people who had been outlines in my life and become living, breathing humans across from me. There are details I will carry that you don't need. The texture of the letters she wrote that I didn't get in time. The exact way her voice dropped when she said she was scared. The laugh Grace has when she tells a joke she knows is corny. The way my mother's hand felt when she said she was sorry and meant it. The red ball cap on the stranger at the river who told me I'd regret what I did, and who was right. Those are mine to keep, and they are the glue that holds together the larger pieces I can hand you. But here is a detail you can use. I went back to that river last year. I don't know why. Maybe because grief does not walk a straight path. Maybe because I wanted to say I'm sorry to water in case it could carry apologies. I stood there and said the things men do not say out loud in movies, because movies do not like men to be too human. A kid stood nearby with a fishing pole he had no business being that careful with. He pulled up a tangle of line and weeds and something that flashed. It was not my ring. It was a pull tab from a soda can. He looked disappointed. I smiled and put $5 in his hand and told him sometimes the treasure is not the thing you pull up, but the fact that you got to stand there and try. If the years have taught me anything, it is that our lives get decided partly by what we do and partly by what is done to us, and the rest by what we choose to believe about the first two parts. I believed for a long time that I had been left. Then I believed I had been robbed. Now I believe I was interrupted. There is a difference. Being left suggests a choice that had me in it. Being robbed suggests a loss that can be measured. Being interrupted suggests the story didn't end where it first appeared to. There is mercy in that word. I have forgiven my mother. She deserved that. She was a woman who had not been given gentleness by the world, and who tried to build her own version of it in a way that broke things. I have forgiven myself for throwing a ring that had done nothing wrong. I have forgiven the men in suits who had to follow rules written with thick pens and never thought to pencil in kindness. I have not forgiven the man who started the trouble by believing he could borrow other people's numbers. I am old enough to know that not every stone is mine to lift. Here is another unexpected turn. After Laura died, Grace asked if she could see the box where I kept the letters. We sat at my kitchen table and read them again. She traced the loops of her mother's handwriting like a map. She asked if she could take a few pages to make a shadow box. She brought it back a week later. She had mounted a letter behind the locket we had bought for Laura when we were kids pretending to be grown. I hung it in my hallway, under a light that makes it look like it's glowing. On nights when the house is too quiet, I walk past it and nod to it like it is an old friend. This is the part where I give you advice. Because if all this was just a story, and not something you could put your hands on, I would be using it for the wrong purpose. If you love someone, learn how to love them in silence and in noise. If you lose someone, do not let the losing turn you cruel. If you are given the chance to forgive, see if you can take it even if nobody is asking you to. If a person shows you their locket and tells you it is empty, believe them and help them fill it with something that matters. And if a federal agent tells you to be patient, know that patience is a muscle. And if you don't use it, it will betray you when you need it. I once thought mind-blowing meant explosions and cliffhangers and people jumping from helicopters. Turns out mind-blowing can be a nurse in an airport counting out a rhythm that brings you back. It can be a box of letters you were supposed to see 41 years earlier. It can be a cup of coffee across from the woman who knows the way you fold your napkin and the things you do when you are trying not to cry. It can be a daughter saying dad for the first time when she is already a whole person, and you realize you don't get to take credit for that, but you get to stand near it anyway. That is my story. I told it because she asked me to, and because I believe someone needed it, and because the life I have left is better when I hold it up to the light instead of tucking it away. If you have stayed with me this long, you're my kind of person. I hope some part of this found a chair in your heart and sat down and stayed a while. Do an old man a favor. That number is still real. 96% of you who watch aren't subscribed, and it makes me a little sad every time I look. Hit that button, give this a like, and tell me what you thought in the comments. Tell me if you've ever had a door close and then open somewhere you weren't looking. Tell me if you forgave someone who didn't ask for it. Tell me if you stood by a river and said you were sorry to the water. I read as many as these eyes can handle. I'll see you next time on Mind-Blowing Stories. Until then, take care of your heart, and if life interrupts you, don't hang up.